There are some videos where I simply retell what I know, adding some minor details that I find in my research. And then there are videos like this, where I discover a whole wealth of deeper mythology and thought that I never knew existed. Pan is perhaps one of the most recognisable gods in Greek mythology, but I was surprised to find that it wasn't always that way. In fact, if it wasn't for one professional runner, he could have disappeared into history forever. In this video, I'm going to go over who Pan was, why his worship nearly ended, and the one event that catapulted him into being remembered even today. Welcome to the mysteries of mythology. Pan. There's a phrase about a messenger crying out, "The great god Pan is dead," and it nearly comes up whenever anyone talks about Pan. So I'm going to try something different and start with another quote. A comic, grotesque little country god kept under control by laughter of the more civilized Olympian deities. Patricia Merivale. Pan was never really a popular god in ancient Greece. There's no reference to him before 500 BCE. He's not written about by usual authors like Hesiod or Homer, and among the many archaic Greek vase paintings we have, there's none with him on it. And part of that has to do with where he originally came from. The mountainous region of Arcadia in the Peloponnese peninsula of Greece was said to be the home of Pan. Other Greeks, excuse the pun, had a dim view of the Arcadians, and they were viewed as backward, isolated and primitive. Athenians would ridicule them, saying they spoke slowly, were inbred, ate acorns, and would turn into werewolves. But the Arcadians were skilled shepherds able to farm on difficult terrain. Their livelihoods didn't need records, so they were illiterate. Pan was the god of Arcadian herders. His name is thought to come from the word pom, which means herdsman and is related to the word pasture. Pan was known as the god of the wild, shepherds and flocks and music. In some versions he had the hindquarters, legs and horns of a goat, and the upper body of a man. However, some earlier images show that he was once entirely a goat, and a dancing one at that. He was also the god of panic, which is where we get the word from, pan-ic. It's thought he got this attribution because of how goats will sometimes just randomly panic and stampede. The Arcadians believed that when this happened it was because Pan had been offended. But it was this ability to cause panic which got Pan into mainstream Greek religion. According to a story written by Herodotus in the year 490 BCE, Athens was facing destruction. A vast Persian force had landed at Marathon just north of the city. The Athenians were outnumbered, isolated and desperate for help, so they sent a professional runner, a man named Pheidippides, to Sparta to ask for help. On his journey, as the story goes, Pheidippides passed through the wild highlands of Arcadia. And there, Pheidippides claimed he had suddenly been stopped by Pan himself. The god appeared and called the runner by name, asking him why the Athenians did not honour him, despite the goodwill he had shown them in the past. Pan promised Pheidippides that he would aid Athens in the coming battle if they would worship him in return. Pheidippides continued on his mission. The Spartans were delayed and the Athenians were forced to fight alone. But after the Battle of Marathon began, something strange took hold of the Persian army, and they all began to panic and run away. The panic of the Persians allowed the Athenian hoplites to charge, and the Persian forces collapsed. The battle was real, and the panic of the Persian army was also real. There's no way to know whether Pan truly appeared to Pheidippides, and whether or not he did isn't what's important here, well, at least to Pan's legacy. What was important was that Athenians believed he did, and that belief changed Pan's place in Greek religion forever. After the battle, Pan received official state worship, and his place in Greek mythology was made permanent. Unlike other gods, Pan doesn't have a throne on Olympus. He rarely visits there and never goes down to the underworld. Pan is earthbound, specifically to wild places. You'll find him in the mountain slopes, in the heart of the forests, in the hidden valley, and in lonely pasture, places where civilization thins out and nature begins to press back in. And more than any other god, Pan is linked to the nymphs. Nymphs were minor female deities bound to specific natural features. They were not immortal in a way Olympian gods were, but they lived far longer than humans did. There were many kinds. Dryads were nymphs of trees. Naiads belonged to rivers, springs, and fresh water. But Pan was especially associated with the Oreads. Oreads were mountain nymphs. They lived in rocky places, caves, cliffs, and high pastures. The same environments Pan was said to roam. In myth, Pan is frequently shown chasing them, dancing with them, or playing music for them. Like most Greek myths, the origins of Pan vary depending on the version. In some, Pan is said to be the son of Hermes. In others, he's linked to older, more powerful gods including Kronos. His mother also changes depending on the source. Most often she is named as Dryope, a nymph from the countryside. In some versions his mother is Penelope, the wife of Odysseus. It has been suggested, however, that Penelope was originally an Arcadian figure, separate from Odysseus' wife, whose name was later reused. This uncertainty around Pan's parentage likely reflects the fact that he was never fully absorbed into the Olympian family tree. The clearest account of his birth comes from the Homeric Hymn to Pan. In this version, Hermes mates with the nymph Dryope. When the child is born, he is already goat-footed and horned. At the sight of him, his mother flees in fear, but Hermes does not. He wraps the child in hareskin and carries him to Olympus. There the gods laugh in delight. The hymn says they name him Pan because he cheered the hearts of all. The story places Pan close to Hermes, and by extension close to Dionysus. All three gods are associated with movement, unpredictability, and life beyond fixed order. Many of Pan's shrines are built directly inside of caves or over their entrances. Even when worship moves into cities, these places were preserved. In some regions, Pan was also adopted as a god of fishermen. This may seem unusual, but fishing took place at the edges between land and sea, safety and risk. So it makes sense that he would be the god there. By the late classical period, Pan began to take on a more personal role in Greek thinking. One example comes from a play by Menander, written in the late 4th century BCE. In it, a wealthy Athenian woman claims that Pan appeared to her in a dream. According to her, the god instructed her to leave her household and visit a rural shrine. She leaves the city, travels to the countryside, and enjoys a picnic. Pan doesn't demand sacrifice or devotion. His appearance serves as a divine justification to step outside social expectations, even if only briefly. Pan was a kind of personal god, not one who enforces rules, but one who allowed their suspension. The same informality carried into how he was worshipped. When Pan was thanked for major acts, such as protection or victory, he-goats were sacrificed to him. This took place during an annual night festival. Torch races were held, and Pan was honoured after dark away from the usual rhythms of civic worship. His priests wore goat skins or animal masks, marking Pan's cult as something deliberately separate from mainstream religious practice. And at the same time, Pan also received very simple offerings. Bread, milk, and fruit were common. In pastoral poetry, shepherds promised Pan milk and honey in return for success or safety. In one poem by Theocritus, a herdsman vows an offering to Pan if he is granted victory in a local contest. When Greek religion spread into the Roman world, Pan went with it. The Romans already had their own rustic goat god, Faunus. Rather than replacing one with the other, the two merged. Pan became Faunus and Faunus became Pan. Pans, fauns, and satyrs began to overlap in art and literature. Goat legs, horns, and wild behaviour became shared traits rather than fixed identities. By the Roman period, Pan was no longer just an Arcadian god. He had become a wider symbol of rural life, instinct, and freedom from constraint. One of the most influential versions of Pan's myth comes from the Roman poet Ovid, writing in his Metamorphoses around 8 CE in the story of Syrinx. Syrinx was a nymph who attracted Pan's attention. When Pan pursued her, she fled. As he closed in, she reached the edge of the marsh and prayed to her sisters for help. As Pan approached, Syrinx was transformed into reeds. Pan, instead of holding the nymph's body, finds only a bundle of hollow stalks in his hands. As the wind passes through them, they produce a soft sound. From these reeds, Pan fashions a pipe, the Pan flute. Late in the story, Pan challenges the god of music, Apollo, to a contest. The judge is Mount Molus, a personified mountain spirit. Pan plays first on his pipes. Apollo follows with his lyre, but Apollo wins. Pan's music is dismissed as crude and unsophisticated, while Apollo's art is presented as refined and superior. And this probably has something to do with how the Greeks understood both of the gods. Apollo represents order, proportion and civilization, where Pan represents instinct, wilderness and the untamed world beyond the city. Going back from the Romans to the Greeks, Pan was often feared. One of the darkest stories involving Pan appears in the later Greek romance attributed to Longus. In this version of the myth, Pan becomes jealous of the nymph Echo, the same Echo from the story of Narcissus. He's envious of her singing and the attention it attracts. Pan sends a madness among the local shepherds. Driven into a frenzy, they turn on Echo and tear her apart. After her death, the earth preserves Echo's voice. Her body is gone, but her sound remains scattered and repeated whenever it's called. That madness he causes is sudden and contagious, much like the panic he was known for elsewhere. One of the most famous stories connected to Pan, which I referred to as the Pan cliché at the start, comes from a much later source. Around 120 CE, the writer Plutarch records a strange account in his work on the obsolescence of oracles. According to the story, a sailor named Thamus was travelling near the island of Palodes when he heard a mysterious voice calling his name. The voice instructed him that when he reached Palodes, he should announce that the great Pan is dead. Thamus did as he was told, and as he arrived in Palodes, he cried out the great Pan was indeed dead. Plutarch says the air filled with cries of grief. The story marked a significant turning point in Western history. Not only was the great Pan dead, but so was the old ways and the pagan traditions. Later authors used it to describe the shift from mythology to modern beliefs. Pan was never really a major god in ancient Greek religion. He didn't rule a domain of the cosmos, and he didn't sit among the Olympians, and he didn't command cities or empires. Pan was a rural god, tied to shepherds, hills, caves and the edges of settled life. He belonged to the margins and not the centre, to places where control weakened and nature pressed close. Ancient writers didn't ignore him, but they never elevated him either. What they left behind were scattered, sometimes unsettling stories, myths of music, desire, fear and violence. But those texts were influential and they survived. And it's those surviving stories that later writers, artists and movements returned to. Pan wasn't originally really that famous. That fame came later from modern generations. So what do you think of Pan? If you have any notes that you'd like to share with the community, let us know in the comments.